Okay, when we talk about the post-Soviet world and the transition from centralized agriculture to agriculture in an open, capitalistic, business-oriented economy, it's not that in every place things have been developed in a very similar way. Actually, have plenty of different models, and we can look into this from different angles. But this is just an illustration of it. For instance, how the privatization of the collective farms, which was, of course, one main feature of the way agricultural land was organized in Soviet countries, happened in every country. And you can really put that in different models, and this graphic is just trying to simplify things quite a lot. But the main idea I want to illustrate here is that the models were quite distinct. So there were, first thing to say is that before, I mean, as you all know, there were two kinds of models. I mean, in most communist countries, virtually all the agricultural land was collective. This applied for all the Soviet Union and for most of Eastern European countries. But in the case of Yugoslavia, for sure, and definitely also in the case of Poland, there was always some part of the agricultural lands which was still in the hands of the small farmers. So what happened with this property structure in the different countries? Okay, in some of them, I guess probably only in Belarus, much of the lands are still in the hands of this collective farms, which are actually very much controlled by the state. So this is just one possible model. But in many other countries, basically these collective farms were transformed into cooperatives, production cooperatives. The whole structure of the kolkhoz was transferred to the farmers, but the land was not really split. I mean, the whole land was kept as a single production unit. This was definitely the case, for instance, at the beginning in Romania, to some extent in Slovakia and in a few other countries, also for some farms in Serbia. So you can see this model in quite a number of countries. In some other places, chiefly in the Baltic countries, land was devolved to the original owners before the communist time. So basically the collective farms were given back to the descendants of the people who were owning those lands before the Soviet occupation there. In some other places, and Georgia is a typical example of this, farmers, I mean the collective farms were just divided and given to the farmers in portions. Then after a few years' time, in most of these countries, some of these individual farmers created their own service cooperatives. In those countries where the farmers are actually the original owners, they are also joining the same model, or they are creating model companies. Most of the production cooperatives that were created in other countries are now either modern companies or they have just disappeared. So there are different ways, different channels, different schemes, but again, what I want to illustrate here is that it was pretty different in every country, and that has huge implications on the shape of the sector in every country. For instance, if we talk about the state-owned extension services, you see the same. Virtually in every communist country, you would have a very vertical, heavy extension service center with research institutes attached and so on and so forth. In some countries, and this is definitely not only Belarus, in many other countries, these structures are still owned by the state. They were never privatized. In some other countries, they were cut into pieces, they were given to local authorities, whatever, so they are still public but decentralized. In some other cases, they are basically now private providers of extension, so the sector was, the extension service was privatized. In some other cases where cooperatives are really predominant, the extension is mainly delivered now by cooperatives. And in many other countries, you have a combination of these different options. So my point here again is that you have different models in different countries. But the striking thing is that when you go to the statistics in some key figures, the situation in most post-Soviet countries, the evolution is pretty similar, but not in Georgia. Georgia is a very special country, and that's basically my whole point here. So I will look into four indicators that I think are very nice to illustrate different aspects of agriculture. One is yields. This is the ultimate output of farming. The more you produce per hectare, the more successful, the more efficient you are. So it's worth looking into that one. Another one is what percentage of your population is working in the sector, right? It's a very nice indicator of demographic, social aspects of agriculture. Another relevant one is how much your agriculture is contributing to the GDP in the country. And the fourth one I will look into here is how significant the sector is for the state. And there is no better measurement for that than what percentage of the budget is going to agriculture, because if it matters, you put money on it, right? So if we try to see how these have been evolving here, on purpose, I'm basically avoiding figures here. I'm trying to summarize information from many countries. So this is not based on actual figures. This is more, if you want, a kind of very informal approach to trends. So what matters here is basically what the trends are. So working force in agriculture in the last years, in the last decades, in former Soviet countries. During the old days, still during during communist times, there was basically a trend to reduce the percentage of people into farming. I mean, there was more people working in farming in Soviet Georgia in the 40s than in the 80s, indeed. Then in the 90s, virtually everywhere, from Poland to Romania and anywhere in between, the percentage of people that went to farm increased. Many people that lost their jobs in the countryside, they start working in the farming sector. That very, not in that long time, start to decline. The number went down. By the time some of these countries, or many of these countries, enter in some engagement with the EU for a pre-accession process, this percentage really start to decline even further. And by now, for those countries that are now members, the proportion of farmers in the overall population is much lower than what it used to be in Soviet times. But if we now try to compare what the situation in Georgia was, definitely during the old days the situation was pretty much the same. But here you have the peak. And this is really amazing. Because the percentage of Georgian people into farming in 95 was 55% of the population, from a 20% before. I've never seen that anywhere else in this part of the world. And the other striking thing is that it didn't decline. It continued during the 90s and up to now. Now it's slightly less than what it used to be. So you see, I mean, it's frankly speaking, it's quite shocking, this high difference. So when we think in the future, what the situation will be one day, Georgia, let's say, would like to join the EU. Will Georgia be able to be at these levels that we normally expect for a country that is going to join the EU, or more likely will have a kind of less dramatic decline in the number? You see, if we look into yields, we will also see now that the situation is pretty different for the case of Georgia. In Soviet times, it gets a certain average yield at some point. Then during the 90s, collapse, breakdown, nothing functioning, yields went down. Afterwards, they start to recover with a huge transfer of technologies, funds, by investors, by the EU directly. This start increasing, and once the countries join the EU, they basically reach the average figure for Europe, and then there is, of course, the plateau here, because at some point you cannot increase yields anymore. So that is what happened in most places. But if we go to the Georgian case, you see, it's not that they declined. They completely collapsed to the level of Burkina Faso. I always say this, and my Georgian friends are very upset, but it's just a fact. I mean, the yields in Georgia are ridiculously low. Of course, in the course of the years, this improved, but just such a little bit. So again, the question mark here is, will Georgia be able to do this miracle and catch up with the level of yields that you might find in a country which is going to join the EU at some point, or maybe not? Our third indicator here, agriculture contribution to the GDP. Not that much in the old days. Then it increased in the 90s. This was not a result of some change in the mind of policymakers, like let's do agriculture more important in the economy. It's just that the industrial sector collapsed and the agriculture was affected, but not as much, because of course agriculture is the most resilient of all the economic sectors. So it managed to keep its level where the economy was going down, so the contribution of agriculture to the overall economy somehow increased. That started declining afterwards, and as far as the countries went to the European path, that contribution to the GDP continued declining, and at some point they are in the 10, 8, 7, 5, 6% that you now see in many of these countries. Again, for Georgia, you see a quite different picture here, because the contribution of agriculture to the GDP in the 90s at some point was absolutely massive, exactly as the percentage of the population engaged in the sector that we saw before. Again, this was not just because, or it was not because agriculture suddenly become very modern and productive. On the contrary, it was because industrial sector completely collapsed, as well as tourism and the service sector. So most of the people were back into basic farming, and there was at least some agricultural output, which was making a huge contribution to an economy which was actually shrinking as a whole. So, but then what happened, and this is really the interesting thing here, is that for this 50% contribution of agriculture to the GDP, it went down to 10% in a matter of 5 years. Because immediately when the country became a bit more stable and some industries start to recover a bit, and also during Saakashvili administration, when some basic features of the economy were a bit more stabilized, there was this recovery, but agriculture was still absolutely neglected. So this is why you see this huge disproportion. What will happen in the future? Okay, if I compare with the other indicators, here I see more chances of Georgia to be, sorry for this, to put it this way, more a normal country, in the sense that it's not that hard for Georgia to have a share for agriculture in the sector similar to the one you find in other countries, because it's almost there already. And then my fourth indicator here, contribution of the agriculture, share of agriculture in the public expenditure. This is not so easy to trace always, so this is more based on contribution of the Ministry of Agriculture as a part of the overall budget. Normally you have other ministries with responsibilities in agriculture, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's not that every single expenditure of the Ministry of Agriculture goes to the sector, but still, we need a proxy here. So before, quite stable. Then, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the communist states, what happened was that this public expenditure went down for different reasons. It was not that popular agriculture anymore. It was associated with, I don't know, something not very modern or not very Western, or so that is exactly what happened. Then this is a very, very typical trend. Once you are in the appreciation path, public expenditure to agriculture will start increasing because of the heavy subsidies and support that Europe, in a way or another, will bring to your agriculture and rural economy. And that will continue, once you are a member state. So despite the less significance of the sector in your economy, your public expenditure to the sector will probably continue increasing for quite some time. Again, this is a very special case of Georgia, where the public expenditure at some point in the 90s was virtually zero. There was 1 year back in the 90s when the annual budget of the Ministry of Agriculture was 1.3 million euros. Then it increased a bit. Now it's something like 2.5% of the total budget of the state. It's still pretty small, but probably now it's more similar to what we could find in other countries in the region. So again, for this indicator, the situation of Georgia is not that different anymore. So the final, there's a word missing there. What I mean here is the crisis. The Georgian agricultural crisis was, okay, there was a crisis, first thing to say, as it has been in the other countries. In these red lines, the most shows what was going on in the other communist countries. Indeed, in Georgia, there was also a crisis, but it was deeper, much deeper. This is the first message here, much, much deeper. And there are good reasons for that. In other countries, there was a certain collapse of the economic model. Here you had war, and half a complete state could break that you cannot easily find in other places. So this is one. And the other is that it was much longer, for different reasons in this case. Because after the country overcome to some extent some of these basic problems, I'm referring basically to the post-Rose Revolution period, 2004 afterwards, still none of the agricultural main bottlenecks were really tackled because of the libertarian approach of the economy at that time, with a kind of ideological barrier against the sector, to be frank. So you have a deeper and longer crisis, which basically explains these features I was describing before. So thank you very much. I don't know if that is maybe too generalistic vis-a-vis what you were looking for, but for more kind of specific things we can discuss afterwards. Thank you.